The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's front porch as he slowly rocked in his wooden chair, sipping his usual cup of black coffee. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran had a daily routine that he followed like clockwork, just as he had done during his years in the Marine Corps. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, wrapped firmly around the warm coffee mug as he watched the neighborhood come to life. Frank's small white house sat on the corner of Maple Street in Cedar Grove, a quiet town where everyone knew each other. His property stood out from the rest, not because of its size, but because of his perfectly maintained garden. Every morning, after his coffee, Frank would carefully make his way down the porch steps, using his polished wooden cane for support. The cane had been a gift from his late wife Martha, who had passed away 5 years ago. The garden was Frank's pride and joy. Rows of bright red roses lined the white picket fence, while vegetables grew in neat boxes he had built himself. Between the plants, small American flags swayed gently in the breeze, a subtle reminder of his military service. The neighbors often stopped to admire his handiwork, especially Mrs. Thompson from next door, who always praised his tomatoes as the best in town. Despite his age, Frank kept himself busy. He trimmed the roses with careful precision, pulled weeds with patience, and watered each plant with just the right amount. His movements might have been slower now, but they carried the same discipline he had learned as a young Marine. Sometimes, neighborhood children would stop by to watch him work. Frank would tell them simple stories about how to care for plants, his voice gentle but clear, carrying the wisdom of 9 decades. At exactly 11:30 a.m. each day, Frank would clean up, change his clothes, and walk the 3 blocks to Sarah's diner. The walk took him 20 minutes now, even with his cane, but he never complained. He enjoyed watching the town as he walked, the small grocery store where he bought his weekly supplies, the barber shop where he still got his monthly haircut, and the post office where he mailed letters to his grandchildren every Sunday. Sarah's diner had been Frank's lunch spot for over 40 years. The bell above the door would ring as he entered, and Sarah Chen, the owner, would call out, "Welcome back, Mr. Morrison." She always had his usual table ready, the one by the window with a clear view of Main Street. The vinyl booth might have been old and slightly cracked, but to Frank, it was the most comfortable seat in town. "Your usual, Mr. Morrison?" Sarah would ask, though she already knew the answer. Frank ordered the same thing every day, a grilled cheese sandwich, tomato soup, and a glass of iced tea with exactly 2 lemon slices. He liked how Sarah never rushed him, letting him eat at his own pace while he watched people pass by outside the window. Other regular customers at the diner treated Frank with respect, not just because of his age, but because of the quiet dignity he carried. Though few knew the details of his military service, they could see it in his straight posture, even when using his cane, and in the way he said, "Thank you," with a slight nod that seemed to come from years of military courtesy. After lunch, Frank would walk home, often stopping to chat with shopkeepers or help Mrs. Thompson carry her groceries, despite his own limitations. Back at home, he spent his afternoons tending to his garden again or sitting in his study, where medals and old photographs lined the walls. Each photo told a story. Frank in his Marine uniform standing proud and tall, Frank and Martha on their wedding day, their children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. The study held another secret, too. In a locked drawer of his desk, Frank kept his service records, medals, and documents from his time as a Marine Corps sergeant. These papers told the story of a man who had done much more than just fight in a war. They spoke of courage, leadership, and a special talent for solving problems that had earned him multiple commendations. But Frank never bragged about these achievements. He believed that true strength showed itself in actions, not words. As evening approached, Frank would settle back in his porch chair, watching the sun set over Cedar Grove. He lived a simple life now, but one filled with dignity and purpose. Little did he know that his quiet routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would require him to draw upon skills he hadn't used in decades. The peace of Cedar Grove changed on a warm Tuesday afternoon when the first rumble of motorcycle engines echoed down Main Street. Frank Morrison looked up from his soup at Sarah's diner as 5 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. Their chrome pipes gleamed in the sunlight, and their engines roared loud enough to make the diner's windows shake. The riders called themselves the Road Warriors. They wore black leather jackets with skull patches and had long beards. Their leader, A tall man with a red bandana, who everyone would come to know as Big Mike, walked into the diner first. His heavy boots made loud thuds against the floor, and the chains on his pants jingled with each step. Sarah Chen, who had been refilling Frank's iced tea, froze for a moment before putting on her professional smile. "Welcome to Sarah's Diner," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Table for 5?" Big Mike looked around the diner slowly, his eyes stopping on Frank for a moment before he pointed to the large booth near the door. "That'll do," he said in a voice that was used to giving orders. The booth he chose was right next to the entrance, making it hard for anyone to come in or out without squeezing past them. The bikers ordered burgers and beer, talking loudly and laughing at jokes that made other customers uncomfortable. Mrs. Thompson, who usually sat at the counter sharing gossip with Sarah, quickly finished her coffee and left. The high school teacher at the corner table did the same, leaving money on the table without waiting for his change. Frank watched all of this quietly from his usual spot, taking small sips of his iced tea. He noticed how the bikers had parked their motorcycles, spread out across 3 parking spots, making it difficult for other cars to find space. One bike was parked right next to the ramp he used when his cane wasn't enough support. Over the next few days, more road warriors started showing up at the diner. They seemed to time their arrivals around lunch hour, when Frank and other regulars usually came to eat. Their bikes took up more and more parking spaces, and their voices grew louder with each visit. Sarah tried her best to keep everyone happy, but Frank could see the worry in her eyes. Her teenage son, Jimmy, who had helped out after school, started looking scared to come to work. The boy had to squeeze between the bikers to clean tables, and they would sometimes stick out their boots to make him trip. One afternoon, as Frank approached the diner's entrance using his cane, he found the ramp blocked by 2 motorcycles. He stood there for a moment, considering his options. Through the window, he could see Big Mike watching him with a smirk. "Need some help there, old-timer?" One of the younger bikers called out mockingly. He was sitting on his motorcycle, pretending to read a menu he had taken from the diner. "Maybe it's time to find somewhere else to eat." Frank said nothing. He carefully made his way up the 3 steps instead of using the ramp, each step calculated and deliberate. His military training had taught him that sometimes the best response was no response at all. As he opened the door, he heard them laughing behind him. Inside, things weren't much better. The bikers had spread out across several tables, leaving their jackets and helmets on empty seats so other customers couldn't sit down. The smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air, even though Sarah had put up no smoking signs weeks ago. Regular customers started avoiding the diner during lunch hours. Sarah's business began to suffer. Frank watched as she tried to make ends meet, offering discounts to attract new customers, but few wanted to eat where the road warriors had set up camp. Even the local police seemed hesitant to help. Officer Jenkins, who used to stop by for coffee every morning, now picked up his drink from the gas station instead. The road warriors hadn't broken any laws that could stick. They were just being intimidating enough to make everyone uncomfortable. As Frank sat at his window table, eating his grilled cheese sandwich more slowly than usual, he noticed Big Mike staring at him again. The biker leader whispered something to his friends, and they all laughed while looking in Frank's direction. But what they saw was just a quiet old man eating lunch. They had no idea who Frank Morrison really was, or what he was capable of doing when pushed too far. The situation at Sarah's diner grew worse as summer turned to fall. The road warriors had made the small restaurant their unofficial headquarters, and their treatment of Frank Morrison became more hostile with each passing day. What started as dirty looks and whispered jokes had turned into something uglier. One rainy morning, as Frank carefully made his way from his car to the diner's entrance, a biker deliberately bumped into him. The impact wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it made him stumble. "Oops," the biker said with a nasty grin. "Didn't see you there, Gramps." Frank steadied himself with his cane and said nothing, but his blue eyes hardened like steel. Inside the diner, Sarah Chen watched the incident with worried eyes. She had lost half her regular customers in the past month. The morning coffee crowd, who used to fill the place with friendly chatter, now grabbed their drinks to go. The lunch regulars found other places to eat, leaving only Frank and a few brave souls who refused to be scared away. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said quietly, bringing him his usual tomato soup. "Maybe you should try eating at a different time, or I could deliver your lunch to your house." Her face showed genuine concern. Dark circles under her eyes revealed how the stress was affecting her. Frank smiled gently at her. "Thank you, Sarah, but I've never run from bullies before. I'm not about to start now." His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that reminded Sarah of her father, a former military man himself. The bikers had overheard their conversation. Big Mike, sprawled in his usual booth by the door, called out, "Listen to the lady, old-timer. Wouldn't want you to break a hip or something." His friends laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the diner's walls. That afternoon, things got worse. As Frank was eating his lunch, one of the younger bikers walked past his table and knocked his cane to the floor. The wooden stick clattered across the tiles, stopping near the kitchen door. Sarah's son Jimmy quickly picked it up and brought it back, his hands shaking slightly. "Here you go, Mr. Morrison," Jimmy said, his voice barely a whisper. The teenager had grown more nervous each day, especially after the bikers started making comments about his mother when he was around. Frank thanked Jimmy with a nod. He noticed how the boy's shoulders were tense, how he hurried back to the kitchen to avoid walking past the bikers again. Something flickered in Frank's eyes, not anger, but determination. Later that week, the bikers started a new game. They would wait until Frank was halfway through the parking lot, then rev their engines loudly, pretending they might back their motorcycles into him. They never actually came close, but the noise and implied threat were enough to make anyone nervous. Sarah finally reached her breaking point. She marched up to Big Mike's table, her small frame shaking with anger. "This has to stop," she said firmly. "You're driving away my customers. You're harassing an elderly veteran. I'll call the police." Big Mike stood up slowly, towering over Sarah. "Police?" he said with a cold smile. "Go ahead, but remember, we know where you live. We know Jimmy walks home from school every day. We're not doing anything illegal, just having lunch with our friends. Right, boys?" The other bikers nodded, some cracking their knuckles for effect. Sarah's face went pale, and she stepped back. Frank watched the whole scene unfold, his stoop forgotten in front of him. That evening, after the diner closed, Frank sat in his study looking at old photographs. One showed him with his Marine unit in Japan, where he had learned that the strongest weapon wasn't always a gun. Another showed him receiving a medal for resolving a hostile situation without violence. His fingers traced the glass of the frame as memories stirred in his mind. Opening his desk drawer, Frank pulled out a small notebook and began writing. His handwriting was neat and precise as he recorded every incident, every threat, every license plate number he had memorized. In another drawer, he found his old address book, filled with names and numbers he hadn't called in years. The road warriors thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but as Frank Morrison sat at his desk, formulating a plan that would draw upon decades of experience in handling difficult situations, a small smile crossed his face. They were about to learn that they had picked the wrong veteran to bully. Late that night, Frank Morrison sat in his study, surrounded by old boxes he had brought down from the attic. Dust covered their lids, and some of the cardboard had started to yellow with age. These boxes contained memories he hadn't revisited in years. Memories of a very different Frank Morrison than the quiet old man who tended roses and ate lunch at Sarah's diner. He opened the first box carefully. Inside was his Marine Corps uniform, still perfectly folded after all these years. The medals pinned to it caught the lamplight, but it wasn't the combat medals that drew his attention. Instead, he picked up a smaller, less flashy award, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for his work in post-war Japan. Frank's mind drifted back to 1945. He had been part of a special unit tasked with keeping peace between American forces and local Japanese communities. While other soldiers carried guns, Frank and his team carried something more powerful, understanding. They learned the language, studied the culture, and found ways to solve problems without violence. One photograph showed Frank with a group of Japanese elders. He remembered that day clearly. There had been tension between American troops and local fishermen over access to the harbor. Instead of letting it turn into a fight, Frank had spent weeks learning about both sides' needs. In the end, he created a schedule that let everyone use the harbor fairly. The solution was so successful that other bases started copying it. Another box held his training materials from the Advanced Negotiation School. Frank had been one of the few enlisted men chosen for this program, which usually only took officers. The notebooks were filled with his neat handwriting, describing techniques for reading people, understanding group dynamics, and finding peaceful solutions to dangerous situations. Strength isn't about who can hit hardest, his instructor had told them. It's about who can think 3 moves ahead. Frank had taken those words to heart, using them throughout his military career and beyond. He pulled out a thick folder marked Confidential, now declassified after so many years. Inside were reports of his missions, though missions wasn't quite the right word. They were more like careful operations in human psychology. In one case, he had prevented a riot by identifying the real leaders in a crowd and addressing their concerns before violence could start. In another, he had spotted signs of trouble brewing between military units and helped commanders fix problems before they got worse. A small notebook caught his attention. It contained lists of people's names, their connections, their motivations, and their weaknesses, all information he had gathered just by watching and listening. Frank had been known for his ability to walk into any situation and quickly understand who held real power, who could be reasoned with, and who needed to be handled carefully. One commendation letter stood out. It was from a general praising Frank's work in resolving a dangerous standoff without firing a single shot. Sergeant Morrison demonstrates extraordinary ability to analyze complex situations, identify pressure points, and apply precisely targeted solutions, the letter read. His strategic thinking and psychological insight make him more effective than a platoon of armed men. As Frank looked through these memories, he thought about the road warriors. They saw themselves as tough guys, intimidating people with their loud bikes and threatening behavior. But to Frank's trained eye, they were like an open book. He had dealt with much more dangerous groups in his time. People who actually meant harm, not just bullies playing at being bad. He picked up a small medal that most people wouldn't recognize. It was for his work training other Marines in psychological operations, teaching them how to win battles without fighting. Frank had always believed that the best victory was one where your opponent never even realized they'd been defeated until it was too late. Standing up slowly, Frank walked to his desk and opened his contact book. Inside were names and numbers of people he had worked with over the years, other veterans who had gone on to become police chiefs, judges, business owners, and community leaders. Many owed him favors from times when his quiet intervention had helped them solve problems. Looking out his window at the peaceful street, Frank allowed himself a small smile. The road warriors thought they were dealing with a helpless old man. They couldn't see the strategic mind that had earned respect from generals, the careful observer who could spot any group's weaknesses, or the master negotiator who had solved international conflicts without throwing a single punch. Time to go to work, Frank whispered to himself, picking up his phone. The skills he had learned in the Marines hadn't faded with age. They had only grown sharper with experience. And now, after all these years, it was time to use them again. The day everything changed started like any other. Frank Morrison woke up early, had his coffee on the porch, and spent the morning tending to his beloved garden. The roses were particularly beautiful that day, especially the yellow ones he had planted in memory of Martha. She had always said they reminded her of sunshine. Around noon, Frank heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles passing his house. He didn't think much of it at first. The road warriors often drove by on their way to Sarah's diner, but this time the engine slowed down, then stopped, right in front of his house. Frank was in his backyard, carefully trimming the rose bushes with his old gardening shears. He heard laughter, then the sound of boots on gravel. His military training made him alert, but he continued his work, appearing not to notice the intruders. "Nice flowers you got here, old-timer," Big Mike's voice carried over the fence. "Real pretty." The words dripped with mockery. More laughter followed, along with the sound of a gate being pushed open. 5 members of the road warriors walked into Frank's garden, their heavy boots crushing his carefully tended grass. Big Mike was in front, carrying a baseball bat. The others spread out, circling the garden like wolves surrounding prey. "You know," Big Mike said, swinging the bat carelessly near the roses, "we've been thinking. Maybe it's time you found a new place to eat lunch. Sarah's diner isn't really a good fit for you anymore." He knocked the head off a yellow rose with the bat. The flower fell to the ground, its petals scattering. Frank stood very still, his gardening shears held loosely in his weathered hands. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes tracked every movement the bikers made. He noticed how the youngest one kept looking around nervously, how another kept his hand near his pocket, how Big Mike's grip on the bat was too tight, revealing his uncertainty. No answer, old man. Another rose was struck down. Maybe you're going deaf too. More laughter, but it sounded forced now. Frank's silence was making them uncomfortable. Then it happened. Big Mike swung the bat in a wide arc, taking out an entire row of yellow roses. The other bikers joined in, kicking at the flower beds, stomping on the vegetable garden, and knocking over the small American flags Frank had placed among the plants. Frank watched it all without moving. His face remained calm, but inside his mind, gears were turning. He wasn't seeing thugs destroying his garden. He was seeing patterns, weaknesses, opportunities. Just like he had done decades ago in Japan, he was analyzing everything. The way they moved, how they interacted, their hierarchical structure. The destruction lasted about 10 minutes. When the bikers were done, Frank's beautiful garden lay in ruins. The rose bushes were broken, vegetables crushed, and flags scattered across the torn-up soil. Martha's yellow roses, which he had tended for years, were completely destroyed. Get the message now, Gramps. Big Mike planted the bat in the middle of a crushed tomato plant. Next time, it might not be just flowers we're dealing with. The bikers left, their laughter and the roar of their motorcycles echoing down the street. Frank waited until the sound faded completely before moving. He slowly walked through his ruined garden, stopping to pick up one broken yellow rose. Very carefully, he placed it in his shirt pocket. Inside his house, Frank went straight to his study. He didn't cry or show anger. Instead, he sat at his desk and began to write. He documented everything: names, descriptions, license plate numbers he had memorized while appearing to watch his garden being destroyed. His handwriting was steady and clear. Then he opened his laptop, a gift from his grandson who had insisted he learn to use it. Frank might have been 93, but he knew how to use modern tools when needed. He began searching public records, social media, and news articles about the Road Warriors. His military training in intelligence gathering hadn't gone rusty. Next, he pulled out his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to an old Marine buddy who now worked in the state police. The second was to a fellow veteran who had become a respected judge. The third was to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, the leader of a legitimate motorcycle club made up entirely of veterans. As night fell, Frank stood at his window, looking out at his destroyed garden, but instead of defeat, there was a glint of determination in his eyes. The Road Warriors had made 3 serious mistakes today. They had destroyed something he loved. They had disrespected the memory of his wife, and most importantly, they had shown him exactly who they were and how they operated. Frank Morrison had spent years in the Marines teaching others that the biggest battles are won long before the first shot is fired. Now, as he reviewed his notes and waited for his phone to ring, he began planning a response that would make his old commanding officer proud. Frank Morrison spent the next 3 days in his study, working with the focus and precision that had made him legendary in the Marines. His desk was covered with papers, his laptop open to various websites, and his phone constantly buzzing with returned calls from old contacts. He was building something more powerful than any weapon: information. Using his grandson's tutorials about the internet, Frank carefully searched through social media posts by Road Warriors members. Each photo they had proudly posted of themselves breaking laws became evidence. Every boastful comment about their activities was copied and saved. His old military training in gathering intelligence proved just as useful in the digital age. Just like Japan in '45, Frank muttered to himself as he worked, "Know your opponent better than they know themselves." He created detailed profiles of each Road Warrior member, just as he had done with potential troublemakers during his military service. Who was really in charge? Who would break under pressure? Who might be turned against the others? His first discovery was significant. Big Mike, who acted so tough at Sarah's diner, had been dishonorably discharged from the Army 5 years ago. Frank's contact in military records helped him learn the full story. Big Mike had been caught stealing from his own unit. The tough guy act was just that, an act to hide his shame. Then came an even bigger find. 3 of the Road Warriors were wanted for outstanding warrants in neighboring states. Frank's police contact confirmed this: small charges like unpaid tickets and minor theft, but enough to cause serious trouble if brought to light. More importantly, the warrants showed a pattern of the Road Warriors running away when faced with real consequences. Frank's most interesting discovery came from social media. The youngest road warrior, who had looked nervous during the garden attack, had a sick mother he was trying to support. His post showed a kid who had fallen in with the wrong crowd, not a hardened criminal. Frank made a special note about him. This might be useful later. By the fourth day, Frank had filled a thick folder with evidence. Illegal activities caught on security cameras. Social media posts showing them harassing other businesses. Screenshots of threatening messages they had sent to people who stood up to them. Each piece of evidence was small, but together they told a powerful story. But Frank knew that just having information wasn't enough. Like a master chess player, he needed to set up his pieces perfectly before making his move. He made more calls, this time to specific people who could help him execute his plan. First, he contacted Judge Thompson, an old Marine buddy from his unit. The judge was very interested in the evidence about those outstanding warrants. He made some calls of his own to neighboring jurisdictions, laying the groundwork for possible legal action. Next, Frank reached out to the Legacy Riders, a motorcycle club made up entirely of veterans. Unlike the Road Warriors, these riders were respected community members who did charity work and helped veterans in need. Their president, a Vietnam vet named Steve Martinez, listened carefully to Frank's story. By the end of the call, the Legacy Riders had a new mission. Frank's third call was to Sarah Chen's uncle, a retired police sergeant who still had many friends on the force. He explained how the Road Warriors were threatening Sarah and Jimmy, showing the pattern of intimidation through his collected evidence. The uncle was particularly interested in the security camera footage Frank had obtained. Throughout all this, Frank continued his daily routine. He still went to the diner for lunch, still endured the Road Warriors' taunts. But now he watched them with different eyes, noting how Big Mike's confidence seemed forced, how the youngest member barely participated in the harassment anymore, how their tough guy act had subtle cracks. In his final preparation, Frank made a call to his grandson Tommy, who worked in local television news. "Remember those journalism classes you took?" Frank asked. "I might have a story for you, one about small-town bullies picking on the wrong veteran." As evening fell on the fourth day, Frank reviewed his work. In his military days, he had learned that the best operations were the ones where your opponent never saw the real threat until it was too late. The Road Warriors thought they were dealing with a helpless old man. They didn't realize that every taunt, every act of intimidation, had only helped Frank build his case against them. The best weapon, Frank remembered his old commander saying, is the one between your ears. Tomorrow would prove just how right those words were. As he closed his laptop and organized his files, Frank allowed himself a small smile. The pieces were all in place. Now it was time to let the trap close. The morning sun had barely risen when the first motorcycles arrived at Sarah's diner. But these weren't Road Warriors bikes. These belonged to the Legacy Riders, their chrome pipes gleaming and their American flags flying proud. 20 veterans, all wearing clean leather jackets with military patches, filled the parking lot with their bikes in perfect formation. Inside his house, Frank Morrison adjusted his tie and picked up his cane. Today, he wasn't wearing his usual gardening clothes or casual shirts. Instead, he wore his old Marine Corps dress blues, carefully maintained over the decades. His medals caught the morning light as he walked to his car. By 8:30 a.m., police cars began appearing near the diner. Not just local police, but state troopers too. They parked strategically around the block, their presence obvious but not aggressive. Frank's friend, the retired police sergeant, had made sure everyone understood the plan. At 9:00 a.m., 2 news vans pulled up. Frank's grandson Tommy had done his job well. The story of local thugs harassing a decorated veteran and female business owner was too good to pass up. Reporters set up their cameras with a clear view of the diner's entrance. Sarah Chen arrived to open the diner, stopping in surprise at the scene. The Legacy Riders greeted her respectfully, and their president, Steve Martinez, explained they were there to have breakfast and support a local business. Sarah's worried expression changed to a small smile as she unlocked the doors. At 10:30 a.m., right on schedule, Frank arrived. As he stepped out of his car, the Legacy Riders formed 2 lines, creating an honor guard to the diner's entrance. The sight of the 93-year-old veteran in his dress blues, walking proudly between rows of fellow veterans, made the news crews rush to get their shots. Inside, Frank took his usual seat by the window. The Legacy Riders filled the other tables, drinking coffee and eating breakfast as they chatted quietly with Sarah and Jimmy. The atmosphere was calm but watchful. At 11 o'clock a.m., the familiar rumble of road warriors' motorcycles approached the diner. Big Mike led his group around the corner, then braked suddenly at the sight before him. Where they usually parked, they found neat rows of Legacy Riders' bikes. Police cars were visible at both ends of the street. News cameras turned to capture their arrival. The road warriors circled the block once, clearly unsure what to do. When they returned, Big Mike tried to project his usual confidence as he led his group toward the diner's entrance. But Frank could see the nervous sweat on his face. As the road warriors reached the door, they found themselves facing Steve Martinez and 3 other Legacy Riders, all Vietnam veterans, all built like oak trees despite their age. "Good morning," Steve said pleasantly. "Looking for breakfast?" Before Big Mike could answer, more figures appeared behind the road warriors. 2 state troopers and a detective in a suit. "Michael Roberts," the detective asked, using Big Mike's real name. "We need to discuss some outstanding warrants from Arizona and Nevada." Big Mike's face went pale. He started to back away, but stopped when he saw more police cars pulling up. Frank watched through the window, sipping his coffee calmly as his plan unfolded. The detective continued, loud enough for the news cameras to hear. "We also have some questions about recent property damage, harassment complaints, and threats made to local business owners." He held up a thick folder, the evidence Frank had collected. The youngest road warrior, the one with the sick mother, suddenly stepped away from his group. "I don't want any part of this," he announced. "I'm done." He walked over to the Legacy Riders, who made space for him to pass. Others in the group began to look uncertain. Big Mike tried one last time to maintain control. "You can't prove anything," he started to say, but stopped when Frank Morrison slowly stood up inside the diner. The old veteran walked to the door, each step measured and dignified in his dress blues. "Actually," Frank said quietly, "we can prove quite a lot." He nodded to his grandson Tommy, who held up a laptop showing social media posts, security camera footage, and documented threats. "But I'm willing to make you an offer, just like I used to do in Japan after the war." The road warriors looked at their leader, waiting to see what he would do. Big Mike stood frozen, seeing his choices disappear one by one. Police on both sides, cameras recording everything, his tough guy image crumbling, and a 93-year-old veteran who had somehow outmaneuvered him completely. Frank Morrison allowed himself a small smile. In all his years of handling conflicts, he had learned that the best victories were the ones where your opponent realized they had lost before a single punch was thrown. Looking at Big Mike's face, he knew that moment had arrived. 1 month after the showdown at Sarah's diner, Cedar Grove had returned to its peaceful self, but with some notable changes. The morning sun shone down on Frank Morrison's garden, where dozens of volunteers were helping replant his destroyed flowers. Members of the Legacy Riders worked alongside local high school students, carefully placing new rose bushes in freshly tilled soil. Sarah Chen moved between the volunteers, offering cold lemonade and homemade cookies. Her son Jimmy helped carry supplies, no longer showing any signs of fear. The diner was doing better than ever now, with the Legacy Riders making it their regular meeting spot every Sunday morning. Frank sat in his porch chair, watching the activity in his garden with quiet satisfaction. The events of that confrontation day had worked out exactly as he had planned. Big Mike and several other road warriors had been taken into custody for their outstanding warrants. Others had quickly left town when they realized their intimidation tactics no longer worked. The youngest member, Tommy Jensen, had made the best choice that day. After splitting from the road warriors, he'd accepted help from the Legacy Riders to find legitimate work. Now he was apprenticing as a mechanic at Steve Martinez's motorcycle repair shop, earning honest money to help his sick mother. Local news stations had run the story for several days. 93-year-old Marine outsmarts motorcycle gang. Frank's grandson had done an excellent job telling the tale, though Frank himself had declined to appear on camera. He preferred to let his actions speak for themselves, just as he had done throughout his military career. The garden was looking better than ever. Where the road warriors had destroyed his yellow roses, volunteers had planted twice as many. Sarah's uncle, the retired police sergeant, had donated special security cameras that now watched over the property, though everyone doubted they would be needed again. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah called from the garden, Would you like to help plant the last rose bush? She held up a beautiful yellow rose plant, the same variety that Martha had loved so much. Frank nodded and carefully made his way down the porch steps, using his cane more for balance than support these days. As he reached the garden, the legacy riders stopped their work and stood at attention. The other volunteers followed their lead, creating a path for Frank to walk through. He moved slowly but purposefully to the special spot they had prepared, right in the center of the garden where Big Mike had planted his baseball bat that day. Steve Martinez handed Frank a small trowel. "The honor is yours, sir," he said respectfully. Frank knelt down, his old joints protesting but his spirit strong, and began to dig the hole for the rose bush. As he worked, he remembered something his commanding officer had told him long ago. The best victory isn't just defeating your enemy, it's turning the situation into something better than before. The crowd watched in respectful silence as Frank planted the rose bush, his weathered hands patting the soil firmly around its roots. When he finished, Sarah's son Jimmy stepped forward with a small American flag, which Frank carefully placed beside the plant. Later that afternoon, the garden work complete, everyone gathered at Sarah's diner for a celebration. The place was packed with volunteers, legacy riders, and regular customers. The booth where the road warriors used to sit was now occupied by veteran riders who treated Sarah and Jimmy with respect and kindness. Frank sat at his usual window seat, eating his grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup. But now he wasn't alone. Other veterans often joined him, eager to hear stories about his techniques for resolving conflicts without violence. Young police officers sometimes stopped by too, learning from his experience in handling difficult situations. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was a place where different groups came together, where veterans found friendship, and where the community grew stronger. Frank's military training had taught him that true strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about building something positive from a negative situation. As evening approached, Frank stood in his restored garden, looking at the new yellow roses. A small plaque had been placed among them, reading, "Dedicated to Frank Morrison, Marine, peacemaker, and guardian of Cedar Grove." But the words that meant the most to him were the smaller ones below. "Martha's roses. May they always bloom in peace." Frank smiled, remembering how his wife had always said that gardens were like communities. They needed care, protection, and sometimes a firm hand to remove the weeds that threatened their growth. The road warriors had been those weeds, but instead of just removing them, Frank had helped transform the whole garden into something even more beautiful. The setting sun cast long shadows across the new flowers, and Frank could almost hear Martha's voice saying what she always used to say, "Everything looks better after a little care and attention." Cedar Grove had proven her right once again.